bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the May 19th, 2026 episode. As our audience on YouTube can see, my guest this week is my partner, Tony Grappone. And our regular audience knows what that means. With Tony being a leader in Novogradac Renewable Energy Tax Credit Group, this is the latest episode in our Renewable Energy Tax Credits Finance series, and it's part 2 of last month's episode. It's the second installment of our 2-part series on 10 timely topics every renewable energy developer needs to know to attract investors in 2026. Now, in part 1, we covered the first 5 topics that developers need to know, need to understand, execute successfully in today's market. Namely, those 5 were the start of construction rules, some key financial modeling assumptions. We also explained how different investors prefer different tax structures. We talked about the timing of investor capital contributions, as well as the challenges of mingling renewable energy facilities with other non-renewable energy asset types. Now, if you haven't listened to that episode, please do. But these do stand side by side. So please continue listening to this episode and then go back and listen to that one. So let's turn now to today's episode, where we're going to round out the list with topics 6 through 10, each of which plays a critical role in investor underwriting and deal execution. Now, Tony and I are just getting back from our Renewable Energy Tax Credit Conference in San Diego. We had some very lively sessions, lots of great information was shared, and there was lots of buzz and networking in the halls during the breaks. And out of that, in addition to the 5 topics we're going to discuss today, based on that conference, Tony has a bonus topic to discuss. So do stay tuned to that. It's a topic that affects virtually every renewable energy tax credit syndication. Now, the remaining 6 through 10, let me give you a brief explanation of each one. First, we're going to talk about the importance of documenting start of construction activity. That's 6. 7, the importance of prevailing wage and apprenticeship diligence. 8, foreign entities of concern or FEOC misunderstandings, or additional discussion about staying away from prohibited foreign entities. 9, cost segregation studies and appraisals and their importance. And then number 10, the rest of the due diligence team and how important that is. We have a lot to cover today. So if you're ready, let's get started. Tony, this is your 36th appearance on Tax Credit Tuesday. I know you need no introduction to our regular audience, but we do get a lot of first-time listeners. So for those who don't know you yet, please start with a short intro of the services you provide to Novogradac clients.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Mike. Great to be here as always. Yeah, so a quick recap on my services. I like to think of them as the 3 silos of services. Silo 1 being transaction advisory related services. We're going to touch on many of them during our podcast today. Those services are things like agreed upon procedure engagements, cost segregation studies, financial models, other types of AUPs for PWA compliance, domestic content, FEOC, you name it, and then related consulting services that touch all of those various services, right? That's Silo 1, transaction advisory. Silo 2 involves things like financial statement audits. Silo 3 involves tax return preparation. And then we've got specialists that focus on each one of those disciplines within each silo.
Great. Thank you. You've done that a few times. Very quick and efficient.
Practice makes perfect.
That's right. That's right. Your 36th time.
There we go.
So, Tony, in last month's episode, we discussed the importance to wind and solar developers of starting construction on or before July 4th in order to extend their place in service requirement beyond 2027. I'd like to revisit the start of construction topic, but this time from a different angle. It's one thing to start construction before July 4th. It's quite another thing to be able to demonstrate to investors that you've started construction. So please share with our audience the importance of documenting start of construction activities to help the investor underwriting process go smoothly.
Yeah, great. And this topic came up at last week's conference too, in a couple of different scenarios. One, with respect to developers that say they started construction on facilities before 2026. Okay. early on in Q1, when I was out talking to the investor and developer community, there was a lot of excitement about how many projects developers started, quote unquote, started construction on before 2026. And then they were going to build on that momentum to start construction on even more facilities leading up to July 4th. Okay, that's great. However, now what we're seeing is investors have finally had a chance to start looking at how developers started construction before 2026 and looking at that documentation around the start of construction profile. And we're already seeing situations where investors aren't totally satisfied with the documentation around what construction started, with the activities and how they started. So, for example, say it's on-site physical work that started before 2026. Maybe the developer only had one photo of something on site. That's for on-site. Now, maybe they started construction off-site, but the amount of work that the vendor claims that they did on an off-site component appears very limited. In these types of situations, the investor isn't totally comfortable with the amount of documentation and even the sufficiency of the documentation being put together. And some developers, they're making these representations on their own with no third party to help corroborate what the developer did. And so what we're hearing from the investors is, based on what they're seeing with the facilities, quote unquote, started construction before 2026, they would like to see a third party come in, look at what was done on the developer side, put together some sort of an analysis that ultimately reaches some kind of determination or conclusion or opinion around the sufficiency of the start of construction activities. Okay, so we're seeing some lessons learned already for the facilities that started construction last year. Those lessons should be learned and carried through to what developers plan on doing leading up to July 4th. Our firm knows the start construction rules extremely well. We're very familiar with best practices in the industry, what investors tend to like to see, et cetera. So we can provide consulting services. In many situations, we can provide AUPs and so forth to help developers kind of get that documentation in place. And just taking another step back, another theme that we heard at the conference from the investors in particular, they are very sensitive to execution risk. Can the developer execute on a closing? When you prod that topic further and you say, well, what do you mean by execution? A lot of that comes down to, do they have the diligence available? Do they have the materials available to provide to the investors so the investors can do proper due diligence prior to closing? And so they want developers who are well organized, have already reached out to the appropriate third parties to get that diligence going, so that when it's time to close, the developers aren't hiring these third parties or starting that diligence data accumulation exercise too late in the process. So that's an overarching theme to these 5 topics today. A lot of it has to do with how can developers better organize themselves to get ready for the diligence that investors need to perform. And a lot of that has to do with getting your team together to execute on these various third-party deliverables.
No, I appreciate the focus on that, because you think sometimes on the start of construction rule, okay, you've got to start construction before July 4th, but it's really a twofold test. One is you have to do that, of course, but 2, you have to document it in a way that investors will get comfortable that they have adequate evidentiary matter that you did start construction by July 4th. And that's very important to be mindful of as the day approaches.
And most investors around these tax compliance matters, they usually do want some kind of third party to weigh in on whatever the developer did and render some kind of conclusion or determination with respect to the compliance around that specific topic.
So you suggesting that maybe investors think a developer might be inclined to think they passed the test in all events?
That's right.
No,
That's
it's just
right.
obviously a lot of our practices on audits and things of that nature. It's third party due diligence that's very critical in the various markets which we work. So let's turn to another third-party due diligence area, and that's prevailing wage and apprenticeship compliance. As you were saying, it's a lot of investor focus on this area, and it's pretty meaningful, obviously, in terms of the amount of credits you're able to claim. So your team works on a lot of prevailing wage and apprenticeship compliance engagements, and feel free to use the acronym or I guess the initialism, I should say, not acronym, the initialism PWA. Feel free to use that term now that the audience knows what it means. So what lessons can you share that you've learned in terms of how best to document compliance with PWA?
Yeah. So with PWA compliance, there's a lot of different service providers out there, a lot of different third-party solutions. And so that creates some confusion in the marketplace with investors because there isn't a uniform compliance solution in the marketplace. You've got a lot of different third-party service providers here, all providing their unique kind of report formats. And so there's some confusion out there in terms of there's not a uniform approach. Okay. And let me give you some examples. So sometimes a developer might use a third-party software solution around payroll compliance matters. Okay. And then they'll generate reports and send that to an investor. And that output might look very different than, say, what Novogradac does. At Novogradac, we put together what's called a PWA agreed upon procedures report with a set of procedures that the investor and developer agree with. So that's your second example. Then a third example might be getting a tax opinion from a law firm. And that deliverable might read very differently than, say, the payroll report versus Novogradac's report. And so investors are looking at these different types of reports and the outputs that they produce and looking for more consistency. Okay. Even further beyond that, one of the things I've noticed about PWA engagements, there's just such a range of skill sets and knowledge across employers of laborers that perform the work. But at the end of the day, this is about employers making sure that the people doing the work to build these facilities are being paid at prevailing wages stipulated by the Department of Labor, and also using apprentices for a minimum number of hours related to the construction. There are many employers out there that are very sophisticated and good about implementing PWA policies and procedures, and they do a great job of complying. But then naturally speaking, you also have certain other contractors or subcontractors that are smaller, maybe less sophisticated, and their internal controls around this aren't as robust. Okay. And that creates more risk with respect to compliance matters. And in those situations, we can see a lot of situations where there are corrective payments that need to be made to workers and sometimes even IRS penalties. One thing I recommend to developers on here is try and get us involved early on. If an employer of a worker finds out early enough that they underpaid a worker, there's an opportunity to make a corrective payment in a timely enough fashion to avoid what can be a very costly IRS penalty. And so I find that when developers hire us early on in the process, we help them monitor PWA compliance throughout construction. And if we're monitoring that throughout construction, our findings notify them early on when corrective payments are needed, and it puts them in a really good position to make that corrective payment in a timely manner to avoid penalties. Okay? That's the biggest piece of advice for developers, is to try to make sure you have a process in place with a third party that monitors compliance throughout construction to save you a lot of money. And then at the end of the day, because we have varying types of reports in the marketplace from these third parties, go to your investor and ask them, what type of output deliverable are you looking for? Okay, what's going to satisfy your concerns? And we've gone through, when we put our service platform together, we did do a lot of outreach to investors to solicit their feedback on what are your needs? What kind of comfort are you looking for here? And so we feel pretty good about our product.
No, as you should, of course, as we should. But I do appreciate your point of asking the investor. And obviously some clients are coming to us because we're talking to lots of investors. So we have access to that. If a developer doesn't have an investor yet, then they can't really go ask the investor. They need to ask an intermediary. But it's really all about what are the investors looking to get, and not trying to convince them that they don't need what they say they want, and just giving it to them within reason. So let's turn to FEOC misunderstandings. And when I say FEOC, I mean foreign entity of concern, even though when I think of FEOC, I also think about prohibited foreign entity, because it's really about getting material assistance from a prohibited foreign entity, or having a prohibited foreign entity having ownership beyond a certain amount and or control. And you're really dealing with that question, the prohibited foreign entity's involvement in a given facility, and is at a level that causes significant issues, to say the least. So within that overall framing of the prohibited foreign entity concerns, or the FEOC compliance, what are some of the bigger misunderstandings that you heard at the conference last week, as well as in your day-to-day work with clients?
Yeah, I think FEOC was probably the most discussed topic at last week's conference. It is the hottest topic in the industry. And so, I'll give you just a few key misunderstandings that we hear about in the marketplace. Obviously, there's a lot of questions around FEOC compliance that people still want to sort through, but I'll just focus on some of the biggest topics we hear the most.
Let me just level set. Maybe you could level set. We had Deputy Assistant Secretary Snyder share his thoughts in terms of timing. Share that with the audience in terms of timing of additional FEOC guidance.
Yeah. Oh, great. We were fortunate enough to get Don Snyder as a guest speaker at our conference last week, and he shared some insights on a variety of FEOC matters, but one was around anticipated guidance. And so Treasury is saying, my takeaway from that was best case, maybe late this year, Q4 was kind of like the best case scenario.
Agreed.
And so I know everybody wants guidance as soon as possible, and you hear lots of rumors out there in the marketplace. You might hear, oh, it's any day now or this quarter or whatever. But I mean, listening to Don Snyder's remarks, I think I'd probably soft circle something like Q4, late Q4, that kind of thing. Now, we did receive guidance earlier this year, back in February, with respect to an IRS notice that answered a lot of questions with respect to the material assistance cost ratio. And that was very helpful. But we're still waiting for guidance with respect to more clarity around specified foreign entities. And then the big one is around foreign influenced entities, or the FIE criteria. But here are the biggest misunderstandings around FEOC, okay? Number one, it's good for people to remember that when it comes to FEOC compliance, there's three main categories. You got the specified foreign entity criteria. I think of that as category one. You get the foreign influenced entity. That's where the effective control provisions reside. And that's category two. And then category three, I like to think of as the material assistance cost ratio, or MACR ratio, okay? So there's three sort of main areas that you need to comply with. Now, if you started construction before 2026, you're not subject to the MACR test, and that's great. But I think the big misunderstanding there is a lot of people think if they started construction before 2026, they don't have to comply with any of the FEOC rules. And that's just not the case. If you started construction before 2026, yes, you don't need to meet the MACR analysis test threshold, but you still have to evaluate whether or not you're a specified foreign entity. You still have to figure out if you've got any relationships with the foreign influenced entity as well. Those two other criteria are still very relevant. So just because you don't have to comply with the MACR analysis doesn't mean you're completely home free on all aspects of FEOC. That's misunderstanding number one. The second biggest misunderstanding is we still hear folks assume, or they're under the impression, that if they meet the domestic content criteria, that means they must meet the FEOC criteria, right? The goods were manufactured here in the US. Well, that's not China, so shouldn't we be all set with the FEOC rules? No, that's not the case. With the domestic content criteria, domestic content requires that the components or the manufactured product components are produced in the US. Okay, so you could have a good that's manufactured right here in the US, but that manufacturer might be owned by a Chinese company. Okay, so fine, you've met the domestic content criteria, but unfortunately you haven't complied with the FEOC criteria because although the supplier was located in the US, they happen to be controlled by a Chinese company, and that would run you afoul of the FEOC rules. On the flip side, another area of confusion we see is folks assume that because they comply with FEOC, that must mean that they comply with domestic content. Obviously, that's not the case either, because with FEOC, you can buy components from suppliers that aren't located here in the United States, okay, so long as those suppliers don't have ties back to China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, et cetera, okay? So I'd say those are probably the three biggest areas of confusion, Mike. They're basics, they're fundamentals, but it's really good to reiterate. Some of these things, you need to repeat them over and over again until they really become like second nature to folks in the industry.
No, that's absolutely right. And thank you for doing that. And I know that you and our partner, Josh Moritz, did a podcast that walked through the various issues in a lot more detail. And I do encourage listeners to go back and listen to that episode. And I will include a link to it in today's show notes.
That's great. Yeah, we did that podcast. But then also, as you know, Mike, Josh helped author the FEOC compliance playbook, if you will. It's the most robust manual or report on FEOC matters. He authored that, and Julia Dinkle with the firm also helped in that effort. It's an excellent analysis of all the FEOC rules.
And I will include a link to that as well in today's show notes. So let's move on to topic 9, cost segregation studies and appraisals. that come into play at substantial completion. Now, as you know, substantial completion is a major funding milestone where investors contribute most of their equity. And as you also know, in connection with the major funding milestone, investors want several third-party deliverables that aid in their due diligence and their confirmation that their capital contributions are due. And one of those is a final cost segregation study. So you can talk to the audience about the importance of final cost segregation study and the role of appraisals.
Great. Yep. So substantial completion is usually more often than not the final funding of an investor's commitment to a renewable energy facility. And two of the deliverables that are required, there's several deliverables, but two that I'm going to talk about right now are the final cost segregation study and the final appraisal. Okay. The final cost segregation study, though, one thing I want developers to appreciate here is that the tax credit buyers or the investors, they almost always require that the final cost segregation study be performed under an IRS approved method that's referred to as the detailed cost engineering approach. And what that entails is the developer providing the cost seg provider, whoever's doing the cost seg, with all of the underlying invoiced and cost support that backs up the costs that were incurred to construct the facility. There's a lot of invoices in your typical renewable energy facility, and that's a little bit of a lead time item. And I think that sometimes catches developers off guard how much time it takes to put that cost segregation together. I think it also catches them off guard in terms of how long it's going to take them to even pull all that underlying cost support and organize it in a way for us to go through. I would assume that's going to take at least a month. I'd say if you're looking at a substantial completion funding date, I'd reach out to your cost seg provider probably at least 4 weeks, maybe even 6 weeks prior to substantial completion, making them aware that this funding date is coming up and to start pulling together all the information. The other thing you could do, kind of like with PWA, we can also monitor some of this activity throughout construction. So if we're doing your cost seg, periodically we could do updates of all your cost support and maintain progress on that front to ease the burden leading up to substantial completion. I talked about the appraisal because the final appraisals also do, but the appraisal, when you do an appraisal, I'm not an appraiser, but we have a partner, my partner David Boyster is. And under the appraisal standards, the appraiser usually has to consider 3 approaches. They've got the discounted cash flow approach. That's one approach. They've got the cost approach, and they've got the sales comparable analysis approach. Well, one of those approaches is the cost approach. And so the appraiser needs to consider the cost approach in doing a final appraisal. So what do they need to do the final appraisal? They need to copy the final cost segregation study. So I think the other thing that developers need to know too is you can't do the final appraisal without the final cost segregation study. And so if the final cost seg is still in progress, essentially so is the appraisal.
Great. Thank you for that and explaining the role of the appraisals and the cost segregation role with the appraisal. I wanted to close out with topic 10, and then we'll get to your bonus topic. The topic 10 has to do with the due diligence team. You've discussed a lot about the various services Novogradac provides on the due diligence front. What are some of the other areas of due diligence that other service providers help with?
Great. So obviously you have legal opinions, especially tax opinions, and those get rendered by law firms. And this is a comment really for your newer developers out there that haven't been through this process before. Oftentimes when I talk to newer developers, they might have their local law firm that they really like. They've done a lot of work with their local law firm. And they have a great relationship. And that's wonderful. I appreciate that. And I've met a lot of really talented, smart local attorneys that do a fantastic job. However, if they're not familiar with the tax equity closing process and some of the players in the market, they just might be inexperienced with these specific needs and might not be able to anticipate them quite as well. And so there's a lot of value that, say, a law firm or an independent engineer that's familiar with the players in the marketplace can bring to the table to help the developer get to the closing table more efficiently. Because they're familiar with the process, they can just speed up the workflow and allow you to execute, again, more efficiently. There's no knock against the great local law firms out there, but it's a nod to the law firms that have devoted their careers to specializing in these industries too.
And I liked your point about how help anticipate issues before they arise, help identify issues so that they get identified and addressed earlier in the process than later, and knowing what items can be negotiated versus not be negotiated and all the rest. And that applies to the other due diligence service providers, even beyond the attorneys, just so they have experience. That's super valuable. So now let's move to our bonus topic. Now it's a topic that was heavily discussed at our Renewable Energy conference in San Diego last week, and it's a subject that has become increasingly common in renewable energy syndications. So Tony, please share with our audience what this bonus topic is.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mike. All right, so the bonus topic has to do with tax insurance or tax position insurance. So this is something, this product, tax position insurance in the renewable energy sector, I want to say that this first emerged maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that. It started kind of slowly. You see it sometimes on a transaction, not always. But over the years, what we're seeing is just more and more transactions involve tax insurance. It's just something that investors and tax credit buyers, it's provided them with that additional comfort level that helps them get their approval process completed when releasing funds. And these days, it's hard to find a transaction close where there isn't some form of tax insurance associated with the investment. And when the Inflation Reduction Act got passed and allowed for tax credit transferability, I think that's when we really start to see the increase in tax insurance. And I think it's because with transferability came new buyers that are very unfamiliar with the renewable energy industry. And obviously with that comes perceived risk and concerns and questions. And I think the tax insurance went a long way to help some of these newer entrants into the marketplace get comfortable more quickly. And since then, it's become very common on pretty much every single transaction out there in the marketplace. It's not that you have to have it. It's not like an IRS requirement that there's tax insurance by any means. It's a commercial thing, but it's just become a very common commercial requirement.
Which I think we all saw coming because we knew that before transferability, the investor was an investor in the entity that was claiming the credits and had to stay in the entity for 5 years. It had operational risks that they had to come to understand and get guarantees for and the like. You had to be pretty involved in renewable energy to be an investor. And now when you can buy credits on an exchange, you don't have to do as much due diligence on the actual underlying investment, but you do have the recapture risk. So there are risks that you're taking. And that's why this tax insurance just fits the role of saying, I've got the insurance, so I can be more secure that I'll be whole if something does happen after there's a time looking through to the underlying development. Are there any other reasons that you would think led to the stark increase?
In insurance, I think the big thing was initially it came out, I think, just because there were different structures in place. There were a lot of different players. The market was still evolving. I think that's what led to tax insurance becoming a thing in renewable energy. But the big accelerant, again, is the transferability market for sure.
Yeah. And it's also one of those, whereas the insurance companies themselves get more reps in and do a better job themselves of underwriting it, they can get more competitive. It's a virtuous cycle.
Yeah, indeed.
So thank you, Tony. You covered the second 5, and then you talked about the bonus of tax insurance. I don't think we've done an episode yet on tax insurance. So maybe part of the renewable energy finance series, we'll do one on tax insurance. But Tony, please stick around for our off mic section. To the audience, if you got value from today's episode, I want to share with you 4 quick ways that you could support Tax Credit Tuesday and help more industry colleagues discover the insights we share every week. Number 1, please subscribe to Tax Credit Tuesday on all your favorite podcast platforms. We're on YouTube, Spotify, and more. 2, visit the show notes to connect with Tony and explore additional resources from today's discussion. 3, please share the episode with a colleague or others in your network. And 4th, if you have questions or ideas for future episodes, please send us an email at contact@novoco.com. Okay, Tony, now we've got our off mic section. As you know very well, we use this space to give a shout out to others working in the tax credit and tax incentive communities. And I try to remember to thank you for this idea because you were the sponsor. You gave the first shout out and you suggested the idea, and I love it. So please take a moment here to highlight a professional who deserves recognition.
Great. All right. So I'm going to give a shout out to Julia Dinkle with Novogradac and her role with our Renewable Energy Working Group. Okay. So the shout out is broadly for the working group. For those of you who aren't members, It is a group comprised of industry stakeholders, includes accountants, attorneys, developers, investors, others that are primarily focused on policy matters. And it works as a fantastic consensus group, knowledge sharing, discussing emerging topics in the industry, bringing thought leaders together, and all in an effort to try to reach consensus on important topics. And Julia is with our policy group here at Novogradac, and she's been taking an increased role in the working group, done a really fantastic job. So I'd like to give her a shout out. I'd be remiss if I didn't also shout out Peter Lawrence, who's been a longstanding leader of the working group. And then, of course, Karen Destro, who supports us in these efforts too. So the working group in general, and then a special shout out to Julia for her increased efforts with the group.
Great. Thank you for that, Tony. I echo the shout out. And all three had time to shine at the working group meeting in San Diego last week. Thank you for that. And thank you for being on the podcast today, Tony. And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.